Let's go. Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to week number 17 here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. As I mentioned last week, coming to you from a slightly different location than usual. So I hope you enjoy the scenery or some of the scenery of Melbourne behind me, just down here for a week of ministry, stealing away some time to be with you for this tutorial today. So here we go. Well, last week, as you know, we focused our attention on some of the dramas of David's life, a couple of significant stories made famous by the characters Bathsheba and Absalom. This week is our fifth and final week looking at David, his character, his conquests and his complexities. There's a few more of them this week as well. Our fifth and final week with David as we close out the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel we're finishing this week, as we close out 1st Chronicles, head on into the book of Kings, and as always read a whole bunch of Psalms thrown in the mix there as well. In fact, I think we've got 28 Psalms this week, but don't panic. Many of them are nice and brief. A lot of praise Psalms this week, which feels a little bit more feel-good than the petition ones, I've got to say. And also this week, you'll notice quite a few congregational Psalms, songs that are supposed or designed to be sung together as a congregation, songs of praise, many of the lyrics of which have made it through to songs we sing today. 3,000 years later, they are still some great lyrics and just as relevant to us as they were back in David's day. Of course, as we said last week, David made famous worshipping God with music and song. Moses may have started it at the Red Sea, or at least the first record that we have in a history of worshipping Yahweh with music and with musical instruments and song, but David very much made it a strong part of the culture, and of course something that you and I essentially take for granted as the way that we worship God most commonly today. A couple of the Psalms you'll notice this week speak very specifically about events relevant to the storyline of the Bible, most notably Psalm 30, which it says was written by David for the dedication of the temple. Okay, a temple that he himself did not build nor even see. He dies. Don't want to surprise you there, but he dies before the temple's even built. And then another Psalm, Psalm 127, written, or at least credited, it says, to Solomon. Okay, and it starts with that famous line, "Unless the Lord himself builds the house, its laborers labor in vain." Which brings us to the narrative this week. You can see a bit of a theme there about the temple or the house of the Lord. That is a major part of our narrative this week. Essentially three things that happen in the storyline this week that really get our attention. Number one, David conducts a census. Okay, it's this infamous census that results in God himself sending a plague to the people. David stops the plague by building an altar and worshiping God, and that place that he worshiped God becomes famous because it becomes the location of the future temple. Okay, it's a threshing floor essentially that David purchases just outside the current city of Jerusalem, although eventually Jerusalem will grow and encompass that area very much so. But it's a threshing floor David purchases, and as a result of a plague, as a result of his census. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to be reading. The second major point that happens this week is that David makes preparations for a temple, including lists, because the books of Chronicles, of course, love lists, a list of the provision for the temple and the people that will be serving at that temple. So very much the vibes of Moses there in that part of the story. And then, of course, the third thing that happens this week with David dying is that Solomon succeeds him as king. And while there is a little bit of drama, of course, surrounding that transition, it is basically relatively smooth sailing overall. Okay, so let's have a look at those three things together. The first thing we're going to note is this famous or infamous census conducted by David. And it really is one of those peculiar stories in the Bible that raises a number of questions for the reader. So if you're reading the story this week and you're like, oh, I'm not too sure about this, don't worry, you're not alone. There's been a lot of ink spilt over the questions that very naturally are raised by this story. One of those questions is, why was David conducting a census, such a big deal to God? Why did it warrant such a significant response from him? Because the text itself doesn't actually explicitly state why it was wrong. Does it demonstrate David's lack of trust in God or lack of respect or his own sort of sense of pride? Well, we don't know. A lot of people sort of raise those as options. Some people say that it wasn't actually the fact that he did conduct a census, but it may have been how he went about it. Back in Exodus 30, when God speaks to Moses about conducting a census, it comes with very specific instructions about how to go about that. There's no indication that David followed those instructions. Maybe that is what ticked God off so much, okay? But then again, the Exodus there's no indication that David had to follow those instructions of Moses. They read as if they were very specific to him in his context at Mount Sinai and not relevant for every other leader in the future to conduct a census that way. So again, these things are up for debate. We're not exactly sure why it was that bothered God so much, or that we know that, yes, it certainly did. The other issue or questions often raised about this census is, what is it that actually drove David or motivated David to conduct this census in the first place? Because the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, and the book of Chronicles seem to indicate two different motivations. Samuel seems to say that it was because Israel was rebelling against God and God was angry. The Lord himself stirred David to do a census and then got upset about it, right? Chronicles looks back and goes, you know what? It was actually Satan that stirred David to do such a thing. So what's the disparity there? Or is it possible that the two things can actually not contradict one another, but do they complement one another? Can actually those two things be true at once? And on reflection, the chronicler is just bringing a different aspect to the story that the author of Samuel's doesn't. What is the author of Chronicles trying to demonstrate by doing that, if that is the case? Well, that's sort of another question raised about this story. And then it raises the question of, well, Chronicles mentions something called a Satan, or Satan stirred David. What is that Satan? Well, who is the Satan in this account? Which may actually sound like a really weird question to ask. Chad, why are you even asking that? Because as Christians, well, of course, we know from Revelation 19, Satan is the ancient serpent called the devil. But hang on. Through the Old Testament, the word Satan is used in different ways. Not in different ways. It's used for different people. The word Satan basically just means an adversary. And so some people theorize, no. Satan in the Old Testament isn't a character. It's not a person. It's a job title. And the person can come and go. There can be different people that fulfill the role of an adversary. And so the word Satan is used, more like a job title, a bit like you can have a president or a prime minister. That's their office, okay? But different people circle in and out of fulfilling that role. Well, in the same way, the Old Testament, there are different Satans, okay? There are different adversaries. In Moses, in the Torah, the word Satan is used when it speaks about an angel of the Lord, that stopped Balaam on his donkey. Remember the angel that appeared to Balaam? Okay, he in that story is called a Satan. He was an adversary to Balaam. All right. In the book of Job, it appears to be, again, a spiritual being, but a spiritual being that has access to God and sort of speaks to God about Job. You remember that part in the story. But in this period of time, in David's era, in the book of Samuel, and also later in the book of Kings, the word Satan is used to refer to people. Human adversaries that oppose David or that oppose King Solomon in the book of Kings. In fact, this week we're going to read a Psalm 109, written by David, that when David's speaking about his enemies, he says to God, "Appoint a wicked man against my enemy, let an accuser," the Hebrew says, "let a Satan stand at his right hand." So it seems even there that David is using the word a Satan, talking about a human figure, to come against his human adversary, a different Satan. So again, this this picture of Satan can be a divine being that is standing in opposition, or it can be a human being. Is this what Jesus meant when he looked at Peter and said, Peter, you are being a Satan to me. Get thee behind me, Satan. Is that what was Jesus not saying you're like the devil in the garden? No. Jesus was just saying you're being an adversary to me. Is that all that simply meant? Well, we can dialogue and dispute and debate these kind of ideas. That's actually not the point. The point, although it makes a very interesting discussion, the point is that David does conduct this census, okay, and a result of that was a plague from God's hand that comes against Israel and particularly against Jerusalem. And Chronicles details more of the detail in this story than Samuel does. He actually the chronicler speaks about an angel that raises its sword against the city. David himself sees it. And when David sees this angel, he buys a plot of land, builds an altar, and that becomes the location, as I mentioned, of a future temple. All right, so that's the first thing we see in the narrative this week. Very key because it sets the story up as to where the temple would be located. We see David conducting a census. The second part of the narrative that we focus on this week is David making preparations for that temple. And this temple that he won't construct, but Solomon will usher in an entire new era for God's people. All right, no longer will Moses' tabernacle be used, but as Moses himself had prophesied, God has now chosen a place in the promised land that his name can rest. Do you remember this promise coming over and over and over again through the Torah? There is a place in the promised land where I will put my name. Well, that becomes Jerusalem. Here it is in the threshing floor on the hill. Okay, that is where the temple will be built. This is a critical part of the Bible story as David makes preparations for that building. And just like Moses was commissioned by God and heard God very specific instructions about the tabernacle, who was to be involved, the offerings that were to be given, how it was to be built, so it is with David. God, or the text this week says that God puts these not only desires in David's heart, but gives him a very clear blueprint as to how the temple was to be constructed. And so that forms a big part of our readings this week. And so that's basically how we finish out the book of Chronicles and Samuel. In fact, Samuel, if you look at a big picture view of the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Samuel, you remember in chapter 1, starts with the tabernacle at a place called Shiloh. Okay, that's where Joshua left it. Hannah is there praying for her pregnancy, a new pregnancy. Okay, that becomes Samuel himself. But it begins, my point is, at the tabernacle with Eli there, and the book of Samuel finishes with David worshipping at a location where the temple will be built. So this idea of God's presence in a tabernacle or a temple is basically the beginning and the end of the book of Samuel. And that's it. We're done. We're finished with Samuel. So congratulations. Which brings us to the third major point of the narrative this week. Not only do we have the census that results in a plot of land being bought. We have preparations for that temple to be built ultimately on that plot of land. But the third thing we have is King David's death and his reign coming to an end as he hands over to his son Solomon to take the throne. And I'm actually going to say more about that next week because this brings us into the book of Kings. But just to say enough in this tutorial to highlight this to you again, just like the book of Chronicles is very different to Samuel. Okay, this Chronicles has a very positive view of and amidst a lot of the drama of the book of Samuel's. So it is with Chronicles and Kings. And so this week, as we read Chronicles, the account of the transition is all smooth sailing. It's great. Oh, David hands over to Solomon. It's wonderful. But the book of Kings reveals that there was some family dramas in the mix. Solomon actually nearly misses out if it wasn't for the intervention of his mother. But I'll say a little bit more about the book of Kings in our next tutorial. All right, I think that'll do for today. Guys, we're going to finish off 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. Head on into the book of Kings. Enjoy the Psalms. Bless you heaps, and I'll see you from another location next week. Enjoy your readings. Bye.